photos. I'm just setting up my screen and we should be good to go in a moment. Okay, awesome. It is my pleasure, my privilege to welcome you and launch the LCT North American series for the next 3 hours. I think I know many of you here. If I don't, hi, my name's Jodie. I used to work at the LCT Centre in Sydney as the manager. And when that wrapped up, I came to Canada, and it has been my joy to be talking to these people in LCT North America. So we do have members in Mexico, in USA, in Canada, but also in Australia, because it turns out evening in North America is morning in Australia. So if you are on this continent, on the South American continent, or on the other side of the Pacific, and you want to join us, we do meet fortnightly, always online, and pretty much all year round, because nobody's on the same schedule. So we keep talking as long as anybody wants to talk. So if you're interested, please get in contact with me. My details are on the screen. In the next 3 hours, we're going to be delivering 3 presentations. First up, we'll be talking about different ways to identify axiological constellations. In the next hour, we'll have a great presentation on investigating semantic gravity in a corpus of 3-minute thesis transcriptions, which is going to be super interesting. And finally, we have a teacher trainer, a teacher researcher, and a teacher trainer researcher, researching teacher training, to talk about how LCT is used in teaching and beyond. So this is going to be great, and thank you for joining us today. So first off, we'll start with our first presentation, Accessing Axiologies, Methods for Identifying Constellations. And so one great thing about LCT-NA is that we always meet online and we get to talk to different people as they move around the world. So it's fantastic to be here today with Eszter and AJ, both currently in the USA, and talking to you today about constellations. The plan for the session will be that we each talk for short presentations with a couple of minutes for questions if needed, and hopefully wrapping it all together at the end. So maybe you don't know about constellations, maybe you do, but let's go to basics. What are constellations and why should you care about them anyway? Well, constellations is one of the LCT methodological tools. So like we have Cartesian planes for looking at codes and tours, and we have profiles for looking at waves and flat lines. Constellations are a heuristic tool for figuring out legitimacy. And in this case, ways of conceptualizing how different ideas are positioned in relation to each other, how they are connected, and how they are constructed. So what are axiological constellations then? Well, just like we can have the semantic plane and the specialization plane and semantic waves and different types of waves, we can have different types of constellations. And constellations where the legitimacy is based on social relations, on something knowery, are called axiological constellations. And they're a particularly useful way of exploring how values and ideologies may be present and presented, how opinions, emotions, and values are all structured together in different ways. So maybe you're thinking, hurry up, I know about constellations, but I need the details. Tell me exactly how to do it. Like I said, LCT North America meets fortnightly. And one thing we realized in conversation is that we had between us at least 3 projects looking at axiological constellations, but we were all using slightly different methodologies. And so we thought that would be useful to talk about today. We'll give you a quick overview of each of these methodologies and hopefully help you decide what you need moving forward. So first up, I'll start by presenting just on LCT itself, a project I did with my colleague Jennifer Walsh Marr. Following that, Eszter will present on work with Namali Tilakaratna on how positioning things as positive or negative can construct a constellation. And so she'll be pairing LCT with, from systemic function linguistics, appraisal system, the concept of attitude. And finally, AJ gets the most complex one to wrap up, not only how things are positioned as positive or negative, but how different voices and opinions are brought in together to construct this axiological constellation. And so he'll be combining attitude and engagement with LCT to form constellations. And hopefully seeing all three of them will help you give you a way to choose what methodologies you need or don't need for your own projects. So to start off with, I'm talking about axiologies of listening. And this is a small project I did with my colleague, Jennifer Walsh Marr, last year. And I want to acknowledge that Jennifer has entrusted me to present on her teaching with her student while she is literally online teaching class at the moment. So thanks, Jen. You'll be able to see her later on in our third presentation pre-recorded. We teach at Vantage College at the University of British Columbia, Canada, in a program for first-year international students, and we teach in the academic English program. And the particular challenge that we were interested in was Jennifer had this particular piece of reflective student writing that was good. It was interesting, it was engaging, but it didn't quite do what we would expect. Like, it had a bit of semantic waves, but not really significant semantic waves. The high points went really high, the low points went really low. There was something else going on making this good. And so we wanted to investigate that. We drew on all the dimensions of LCT, but ultimately resolved on axiological constellations to show what was going on. And in order to investigate this text, we had to go back and identify and explore a video of a speech that the students were shown in class, as well as this text, which reflected on watching the video and ideas in the video. So the video itself is called How to Be a Better Listener by Sheila Rogers, who is a beloved Canadian journalist and mental health advocate. She was also an honorary witness to Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission into the Indian residential school system. And she reflected on all these experiences at an event for Canada's sesquicentennial, which is its 150th birthday. And you can see on the screen, it's not even 9 minutes long, it's on YouTube. And Jennifer introduced this in her class at just over halfway through. The reflective writing piece was written by the student, and Jennifer incorporated this into her classes in order to support the reflective writing students had to do in their arts courses. And this particular assignment came at the end of 26 weeks, 2 terms of coursework. The students were asked to select an activity, an experience, or a concept from the course to reflect on in this final assignment. And this student chose to write about Rogers' How to Be a Better Listener. And she relates it to her experiences growing up in Afghanistan, coming to Canada, and really describes a process of self-actualization where it's not a revelation, but in fact, she recognizes values in this video that she's always had in her life, and she resolves to take with her into the future. So the methodology, quite simple, 2 main steps. First, identify the central signifiers. And this is going back to Knowledge and Knowers, chapter 8, basic constellation analysis. What were the main ideas, themes, or concepts present in the video, in the assignment? Then I explored the associated signifiers to map out the constellations. And then importantly, I used what Mayton and Chen call a process of soft focus and hard focus analysis. So I immersed myself in the data. I discussed this at length with Jennifer, knowing that she knew her student, the assignment, the video, the Canadian context, all of these things, discussed the interpretation, and then went back to the theory to look at the definitions, check our examples against the definitions. And of course, importantly, as I'm sure everybody here knows, talking to your LCT group, talking to LCT-NA multiple times to test out these ideas and explore what was plausible, what was real, what was valid, what was interesting. So in these 2 texts, what we found, the central signifiers in the video were listening, and the associated signifiers were people as listeners, but also processes of listening. And I'll show you in a moment how those come together. The students' constellations were related, but slightly different. So she constructs these central signifiers around silence and noise and giving and receiving. and she associates them with different experiences, her experiences in Afghanistan, in Canada, in the past, in the future. And these are very aligned and disaligned with, both the student aligning and disaligning with them, and her contrasting them or relating them to each other. So I'll quickly show you a few glimpses of the constellations this method generated. So this is an abbreviated list of the constellations of listeners that Rogers presents in her speech. And I've chosen 3 of the key people present that she describes. First, she talks about herself. Then we have the commissioners of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the Indian residential school survivors. And each of these groups of people and the other people mentioned in the talk are positioned in relation to Rogers, how she knows them, how she interacted with them, what she says about them, what they say about her. But importantly, she constructs this constellation around listening and listeners. So how are they validated as listeners? And this is a way of all participants to come together within Canada, First Nations, settlers, and beyond, under this notion of being a better listener. So she describes herself as a developing listener, somebody who's learning to listen, who hasn't always listened when she should. The commissioners are held up as great examples of listeners and models for Canada. And the survivors are presented as people who need to be listened to, who haven't been listened to, and who are owed ongoing and informed listening. So this constellation of people creates a way to include lots of people at this event for the sesquicentennial. She also constructs a constellation of listening as a process. So what are the conditions required for listening and what are the results of? So the conditions for listening requires paying attention, shutting up. And she describes not shutting up herself at an important point. And then when listening happens, what are the results? And she describes this as true and respectful hearing of other people, responding when response is required and being silent when it's not, and ultimately healing for Canada as a nation. And this transactional notion of listening as something that is given and received is something that the student picks up and works with in her text in a couple of different ways. One way is in this paragraph, and this is a 3-paragraph text, it's not very long, but she constructs this binary of listening and silence. So these 2 concepts are not opposition, but they're like twin stars in the constellation, things that are connected if separate. And she recognizes the values of listening and silence in the video. She relates them and grabs onto them in her own life, and she resolves to continue with them in the future with the importance of them. Finally, this oppositional constellation that I alluded to, these alignments and disalignments, these things positioned in contrast that she variously aligns with herself and distances herself from. So she aligns with this silence, peace, listening, respect, acknowledging somebody else's existence. And she disaligns this or contrasts this with noise in war-ravaged Afghanistan, not feeling heard, not feeling seen, not feeling like she existed as a teenager, as a girl growing up. And through this whole, she presents this process of self-actualization where she takes these contrastive constellations and chooses her values moving forward. So what we see are shifting constellations. The axiological positioning of listening and the constellations around it in Rogers' speech were repurposed by the student in her assignment for her own purposes to describe her own experiences. So methodologically, what did axiological constellations tell us? One thing I like about this project is we actually did look at the stimulus as well as the student text, and we can see how these constellations, these values are taken and shifted between them. It also shows how reflective writing can take different forms, present different bases of legitimacy, and how different values can be represented for different people, for different audiences. Methodologically, my tip would be to remember that signifiers can be connected in different ways. It's not all this is the same as that, or this is the opposite of that. It can also be cause and effect, similarities and differences, connections in all sorts of ways make a connection. If you are interested in pursuing this methodology for your own project, What should you read? Well, of course, going back to Knowledge and Knowers, Chapter 8, Cosmologies, How to Win Friends and Influence People. And then hopefully, currently under review, our chapter, which will be called Framing the Looking Glass, Reflecting Constellations of Listening for Inclusion. So we have a couple of minutes for questions before I'll hand over to Eszter. But if you have any thoughts after the event and want to get in contact with me, or maybe you're watching a video of this, please, my contact details are on the screen. So I'll just give it a moment if anyone has any questions. Thank you.
Hi, Jodie.
Hi, Sharon.
How are you? That was so interesting. And thank you. I'm still learning to immerse myself in these axiological constellations. And I was really interested in what seems like a small detail where you decided to describe the moments you're analyzing as signifiers rather than going to the sort of notions of ideas, even though I know that was encapsulated. That does lead you into a certain world. So can you just tell me a tiny bit about why you picked signifiers as kind of the way of describing your object?
I think the data set combination of, that's one of the words used in Chapter 8, Knowledge and Knowers, but also often when we talk about values and other studies, we've seen these big ideas of like truth or honesty or those sort of level of ideas. Listening idea is kind of not quite the thing. It's a practice, it's a process. And so really tapping into this as it's a thing which has meaning, and that meaning is going to be constructed by the constellation. I think that's what really resonates for me, is that this meaning, it's something which means something from the constellation, not in and of itself necessarily. Well, I don't want to say it's empty of knowledge in itself, but you know what I mean? It's triangulated within that constellation.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
No worries. One more question or comment, and awesome. Thanks for everyone saying hello in the chat. Great to see you all. I'll hand over to Eszter to now explain how you can put together constellations with attitude.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon from Vermont in the United States, wherever you are in the world. If you don't know me or haven't met me yet, my name is Eszter Szenes. And I'm going to now present another approach to constellation analysis that I developed together with Dr. Namali Tilakaratna, who is at the Center for English Language Communication at the National University of Singapore. So today my aim is to model this analytical methodology for identifying axiological constellations. So I'll walk you through the steps of the methodology to show you what elements we look for and to show how constellation analysis can help us uncover the values, the models, and the attitudes that underlie particular communities or subcultures and how members legitimize their membership. So before I start, or before I show you this methodology, I wanted to remind us of this really great quote by Carl Mayton, who quotes Ernest Gellner, who describes ideology as a system of ideas with a powerful sex appeal. So when we think about axiological meanings specifically, we are talking about what Carl calls a moral ordering, which works to allocate ideas and authors to different poles of field as either on the side of good or evil. So to understand what happens in different fields, we need to understand how such an axiological cosmology works. I want to acknowledge that this methodology was born out of a very long ongoing collaborative work that started at the University of Sydney with Carl Mayton and Namali Tilakaratna. So these are some of our very early publications. We were looking at the knowledge practices of critical reflection in undergraduate reflective writing. And then progressively, as the years have passed, we kind of consolidated this methodology in these two publications when we looked at uncovering disciplinary values in social work and business reflective assignments. So this methodology is the result of this ongoing collaborative work. But today I'm going to show you data from a different project. So now I'm going to kind of go into detail about what we look for and how when we want to analyze axiological constellations. So the data that I'm using for today's presentation comes from my project on analyzing white supremacist ideology. It's part of a larger research project that investigates radicalization strategies in online far and extreme right propaganda and disinformation campaigns. I just want to warn you that the data that you will see contains anti-Semitic hate speech. So if anybody wants to leave, please feel free to do so. And the data that I'm using is from the Nordic Resistance Movement's manifesto that's titled Our Path, New Politics for a New Time. It's a 56-page long document, and the Nordic Resistance Movement is the largest, the most active, and the most violent neo-Nazi organization that operates across the Nordic countries. So as Jodie mentioned before, in our methodology, we combine LCT with the appraisal framework for SFL that we use as external language of description, focusing particularly on the language resources of attitude and occasionally on graduation. So this is our coding scheme that I will use for presenting the data. So what are we doing here when we analyze axiological constellations using appraisal and the concept of axiological cosmology? So the first step is to identify the attitudes, the values, and the morals that color a text. So we want to look for evaluating items. These are realized by the resources of attitude. We also want to look for their target. So what is actually being evaluated by these evaluating resources? And then, of course, it's really important to look at their charging, whether they're positive or negative. So I'm just going to show you a very quick example from the manifesto. So this clause reads, "It is our race and all of mankind that is being threatened by the misanthropic and parasitical forces that control and conduct ruthless exploitation of nature and all its populations, man and animal alike." So if we want to find the evaluative meanings, I highlighted misanthropic and parasitical, and their target is forces that control and conduct, etc. So here we've got two instances of negative judgment. These together, the target and the evaluation, make up what we call a coupling. So then in step 2, we want to search for further mentions of the same target and see how these are evaluated. And these can be constructed by a range of grammatical elements like synonyms and references, repetitions. So in this example, we saw the word forces. So I wanted to know, okay, so who are these forces? So when I traced all these subsequent mentions in the whole text, I saw that it actually refers to an old conspiracy theory that's very common in white supremacist literature, global Zionism. So these were all, it's a non-exhaustive list of all the mentions, like the destructive forces, a relatively few people, the self-appointed elite, the global Zionist elite, etc., etc. So then we're interested in how they're evaluated. So just an illustrative example here. So if we look at these references and synonyms, you see that the evaluation of global Zionism is exclusively negative. Most of the resources that the Nordic resistance movement chose to describe them by is negative judgment propriety, in some cases negative judgment normality. But overall, looking at the same kind of target evaluated by a repeated pattern of negative judgment together construct a negatively charged cluster. So then based on this, Namali and I, in relation to our work on reflective writing, we find similar patterns in those kinds of texts. So we kind of came up with a definition to define what a cluster is. So when the same target is repeatedly evaluated by instances of positive or negative attitude, such recurring patterns of couplings that accumulate over the course of a text or texts can be generalized as positively or negatively charged clusters. So this is our definition of a cluster based on a range of couplings. So of course, after identifying one cluster, we'll find others depending on the length of a text. So you want to repeat the process for other targets. So I'm just showing you a few examples here. So for example, the topic of environmental degradation is almost exclusively evaluated by negative judgment, ditto for multiculturalism. So environmental degradation and multiculturalism are evaluated as unethical in the Nordic resistance movements manifesto, while immigration is evaluated as abnormal. So these are some of the negatively charged clusters that realize their grievances. So then the following step is checking what constellation of ideas is a cluster part of. As Carl Mayton said in his book, clusters can link up with other clusters to form axiological constellations. So we can take some certain meanings for granted. And axiological constellations reveal specific worldviews, logic, or belief systems. So in my project, then I wanted to see what constellation of ideas the clusters global Zionism, multiculturalism, or immigration are part of. So as you can see, there are quite a lot of clusters that realize Nordic resistance movement grievances in their text. Almost all of these can be traced back to global Zionism that is made responsible for all these problems. And of course, as a response to their grievances, the Nordic resistance movement also suggests a whole bunch of solutions. So when we think about clusters that are completely negatively charged, especially in longer texts, we might find oppositional clusters that are directly made as opposite. For example, in the Nordic resistance movements manifesto, one of their grievances is liberal democracy. So in the text, they oppose this to authoritarianism, or they complain about deforestation. So then they construct a cluster here that's positively charged about reforestation, etc., etc. So the negatively charged constellation of their grievances is opposed to their positively charged constellation of their solutions. So if you want to see more detail about these steps and how to apply this methodology, I wrote it up in a paper on neo-Nazi environmentalism in the Journal for De-Radicalization. So you will see all these examples in a lot more detail. So we got to the question, so what? Why is this methodology useful? So first of all, after doing the appraisal analysis, we can get from couplings to clusters and then see how clusters form constellations. And in terms of analyzing each cluster that actualizes a grievance in the text that I analyzed here, it condenses a repeated pattern of negatively charged attitudinal couplings, while each cluster that actualizes a solution condenses a repeated pattern of positively charged attitudinal couplings. I also showed you that the negatively charged constellation of NRM grievances is constructed in opposition to the positively charged constellation of its solutions. And overall, this methodology made visible the axiological constellations that make up the NRM's ideology without having to rely on subjective interpretation of the data. So I think this is the most important point to make. We do not need to bring in our subjective feelings about any topic. You actually have the language resources, the evidence, using the concept, LCT concept of axiological constellations together with SFL appraisal systems, I think is a really powerful methodology. And we can actually provide evidence for our claims in our research. So as for impact, I just wanted to show you to close the different contexts and the disciplines where this methodology has already been applied. So I'm using it in my current work on ecofascism, but I look at the nexus of climate change and violent extremism. Then with a couple of colleagues in linguistics, with Rob Lawson from City University of Birmingham and Gavin Lamb at the University of Oslo, we are looking at discourses on Twitter around Greta Thunberg, focusing especially on eco-misogyny. Then here at the Peace and War Center at Norwich University, we are looking at information warfare, especially focusing on Russian disinformation campaigns, where we're looking at oppositional clusters. Then at the National University of Singapore, Namali and her colleagues, Letitia Momback and Mark Brook, have used this methodology to analyze undergraduate EAP writing courses. Namali is looking at undergraduate nursing, and Letitia is looking at color semiotics. So it's quite exciting to see that there are so many projects already using this methodology. So, okay, so I suppose this is it from me. Just looking at the time, perhaps I'll hand over to AJ before we have questions, just to make sure we don't run out of time.
Okay, I hope that I don't run out of time. That would be really bad. One moment. It's very exciting for me to be able to present with Eszter and Jodie today, because I certainly looked up to them in the past with my work in axiological constellations, and now to be able to present with them is really nice. So I'm AJ Jackson. I'm currently an English teacher at Montpelier High School in Vermont, USA, but this work was carried out as part of my PhD at the University of Georgia in the United States. So I'm going to be talking about axiological constellations in heteroglossic texts. And so first, let me hide this. I will start with the idea of heteroglossic text, which actually comes from Mikhail Bakhtin, but we see a lot in the work of Martin and Rose, Jim Martin, others in SFL. So heteroglossic texts contain multiple voices. So ideas are attributed to others within the text by the writer. They construct evaluations between the ideas and entities within the text, positioning things in opposition to each other, as we've seen so far. And they construct value positions among entities and ideas around particular issues. And I'm going to be talking about how those value positions are played up or downplayed to achieve an ideological effect, as has been shown elsewhere as well. So what do heteroglossic texts do? They create a space for multiple perspectives on an issue. So the context of this study was I was analyzing essays that were created in a grade 8 subject English classroom. The task was literary analysis of excerpts from the Harry Potter fantasy novel series. And the writing prompt was to compare and contrast characters' views on enslavement, elvish enslavement in the novels, which, as Jodie pointed out in the chat, is another serious issue that I like how Eszter said we can get at how writers are constructing value positions in opposition to other ideas and value positions without having to go into subjectivity. It gives us a basis for our interpretations. So this is an excerpt, a very small excerpt from what was essentially a 2-page, 5-paragraph essay, 1 paragraph on each of the characters, but I will read this from part of a paragraph that directly concerned Harry Potter from a high achieving response. Finally, the protagonist of the Goblet of Fire, none other than Harry Potter, is torn between the two extreme positions in regards to house elves. He does not want to pick a side because his loyalty to Hermione and Ron. Much like his best friend Ron, he is a pure-blood wizard who cannot sympathize with the discriminated house elves. Reasoning more with Ron than Hermione, Harry does not want slavery to be abolished as long as they have proper treatment. This is a very problematic point of view because slavery is not in the least bit okay, even with the absence of brutality, the writer goes on to say. So this is just a small example of what the texts were like as they investigated the characters' value positions in regard to this highly charged issue. So essentially the student essays become heteroglossic texts in which they are revoicing or giving voice to each character's view on elvish enslavement. So my research questions for this project studying these different student essays were, how did the writers construct value positions in relation to the ideas and entities in the text? And how did the writers emphasize and downplay different value positions after they constructed those to create their own value position in regard to the issue? So I'm going to show the method that I used, which comes from Jagen Duran's 2020 chapter in Accessing Academic Discourse, which I will also plug at the end. And I was at first using methods that as I said before, I borrowed from Mate in 2014, some of Namali and Eszter's early work. But what I found was that creating oppositional clusters wasn't enough. It wasn't getting at everything that was going on in these texts. So using Jagen's method, I was able to have multiple steps. Step one being an attitude analysis, not that different than what Eszter was just showing, which identified the explicit and implicit attitudes in the text. Really, not necessarily their strengths, but really their polarity. In step two, I carried out an engagement analysis. This identified how values and their sources aligned and disaligned with other ideas and entities in the text, ideas and entities that were non-evaluated. And then step three was grouping these findings together, these elements, as Eszter referred to them, together into constellations, which were associated with and opposed to particular viewpoints. And I'll get into the complexity of that nuance towards the end. So first, I won't spend too much time on this, but when this is the full Harry paragraph that I just read the first quarter of. And all I wanted to show you here is how I went through and was identifying attitude, underlying inscribed attitude, putting flagged attitude in bold and provoked attitude in italics. So inscribed attitude would be attitude that is built into the definition of the word. So the word proper, when used as a modifier in this text, was positive. Tyrannizing was negative. Flagged attitude was attitudes that were highlighted by the author using words such as things like vary, which is strengthening by graduating, probably more force, I believe, for that negative evaluation. And then we had provoked attitude. Provoked attitude is essentially metaphorical. So we have phrases like having weight on someone's shoulders, a burden that's weighing you down, being a negative way of showing negative attitude. So this first step, again, as Eszter and Jodie are showing, when we identify these attitudes, we're able to build up elements in oppositional clusters. This is one example of a sentence from the text I just read, which is, Harry does not want slavery to be abolished as long as they have proper treatment. And where Eszter was also just showing that we identify the attitude and then the target of the attitude, I'm also concerned with the source of the attitude. So in this case, the source of the attitude is Harry, and of course the larger source is the student writer themselves. But here, this attitude is being assigned to Harry. So he is the source of the attitude. He is appraising the treatment of elves. In fact, he is appraising the possible treatment of elves as they endure enslavement. And here, that is seen as positive. Harry views the possible treatment of house elves under enslavement as positive. And I think already you can see kind of the problematic position that Harry is in. So this is just one quick example, but after you identify sources, targets, and polarity, you create tables such as this one. And again, this is a small sample from the data, where you begin to accumulate sources, targets, and we can identify their charge. So here we have two sources that I've pulled together in this table, where we have a student writer, and it's in parentheses because they did not, they were making claims without saying, I believe this. But the student writer appraised Harry as negative, discrimination against house elves as negative, Harry's point of view as negative, slavery as negative. And then if we move down, we have Harry appraises freeing the house elves as negative. He appraises friendship as positive, Hermione's expectations as negative, and Hermione's passion as positive. So this is essentially one step that allows you to pull together lots of elements together to form constellations that are either positive or negative in relation to the issue. But what I'm going to spend more of my time talking about today is step 2 of this analysis. So once we've pulled together these ideas, we can create those into oppositional clusters. But engagement analysis shows us how values and source are sourced and readers are aligned. It shows how the entities and ideas in the text are aligned and disaligned with the previous value positions that were shown in the appraisal analysis. So we have 4 linguistic resources that we use in addition to appraisal to accomplish this. The first being projection, including heteroglossic acknowledge, which is essentially when we say that someone said something. So in this case, the example is Ron Weasley has an opposing opinion on the house elves, emphasizing the claim they like being enslaved. That is a awkward phrasing by this student, but essentially could be rewritten to say Ron Weasley says they like being enslaved. So the source, Ron, aligns with the proposition that is in quotes. So here we don't have attitude, but we have Ron being aligned with an idea. And then we can see how that idea fits into other evaluated, among other evaluated entities. The next linguistic resource, and again, these are coming from Jagen's methodology, is proclaim. In this example, we have, since Harry has experience with this master-slave dynamic with house elves, he has a sense of supremacy over the creatures. So here, the source is aligning with the proclamation because the writer is providing reasoning to support that connection. When we turn to disalignment, we have linguistic resources for disclaim. Typically, these are going to be seen in negatives. So slavery is not in the least bit okay, even with the absence of brutality. Here, the writer disaligns with the proposition by negating it. And the last linguistic resource here is distance. Distance also shows disalignment. We have this example, he, here is, this is referring to Ron actually, but he assumes the house elves enjoy being enslaved. In this example, the writer is disaligning with the proposition and the source by creating an unstable relationship between the source and the proposition. So if we go back to projection, the writer could have said, he says the house elves enjoy being enslaved, which is in fact what Ron says. But by using the word assumes, the writer is creating distance between themselves and that idea. They're creating this instability that shows that Ron may in fact be wrong, as he is, I believe. So engagement shows, once we pull them together in a table, and again, this is a small snapshot, engagement shows alignment between entities and ideas. So for example, we have Harry aligning with Ron, which also aligns him with Ron's pro-slavery ideas and creates a pro-slavery position towards the issue. Harry also aligns with the phrase, because he says it, this is a proclaim, how do we do all this? His ambivalence towards abolition, which creates an anti-abolition stance. Harry also aligns with a sense of supremacy over the creatures, which is a supremacist ideology, which makes him pro-slavery. I had another example that I cut off for time. So engagement shows us alignment between entities and ideas, but it also shows disalignment among entities and ideas. So in these examples, we have Harry disaligning with Hermione's expectations, those being that freedom and equality are possible, which creates an anti-abolition stance. Harry's also disaligning with being willing to contribute to the cause, so therefore again anti-abolition. And Harry disaligns with sympathizing with the house elves. He cannot sympathize with the house elves, which makes him, makes him pro-slavery. Sorry. All right, so once we bring the sources and targets together from the appraisal analysis and from the engagement analysis, we end up with multiple constellations. So again, this is more complicated than we see in chapter 8 of Knowledge and Knowers or in just oppositional constellations, because we have so many different ideas being attributed to different sources. So in constellation 1, we will see ideas that are associated with the issue, and then things can either disalign or align with that position. And then we have another constellation that would be opposed to the issue, and entities and ideas will either align or disalign with that stance. So bringing it into this study, constellation 1 will be associated with enslavement, and if you align with that stance, if you align with being associated with enslavement, then you are pro-slavery. And if you disalign with being associated with enslavement, you are taking a stance of anti-slavery. The other constellations show positions that are opposed to enslavement. So if you align with being opposed to enslavement, then you are for abolition. If you are disaligned with being opposed to enslavement, then you are anti-abolition. And so when we pull all of these sources and ideas and entities together, this is for text 1, the high achieving text that was very dense. What we can see here is that rather than reading all of the information, we can see that these dense constellations associated with enslavement, they position Harry among slave owners, purebloods, and other ideas, including Hermione's passion, friendship, things like this. But all of these position Harry on the side associated with enslavement. And there are other ideas that are disaligned with being associated with enslavement, including Hermione, her expectations, house elves, and things like that. So basically, this is a very dense constellation for this data set that shows both sides of the issue and kind of who's on either side. And before moving to the constellations that are opposed to enslavement, I wanted to show just one example of a text that did not create dense constellations. So in this constellation associated with elvish enslavement, it's a very sparse constellation because it's downplaying Harry's associations with enslavement, and it barely discusses them at all. Moving back to text 1, when we talk about the constellations opposed to elvish enslavement, what we have happening here is this is actually a very unbalanced constellation, because this is one long statement saying that American history would show that slave owners can free enslaved people without being on the side of abolition, which is an idea that would be opposed to elvish enslavement. And then the student writer positions themselves as opposed to elvish enslavement. They position the house elves as opposed to elvish enslavement. But there is a lot of information that is disaligned with the stance of being opposed. And so this unbalanced constellation opposed to enslavement positioned Harry and those associated with him as an anti-abolitionist, as opposed to being opposed to elvish enslavement. And this can be contrasted with text 2 as well. We have an imbalance in the other direction. So this unbalanced constellation, which is opposed to enslavement, positioned Harry on the side of abolition, because it basically says that in the future he would do these things. So there is very little on the side that would be opposed to elvish enslavement. So this writer shied away from the very information that this writer emphasized. So we see these two writers downplaying different sides of the issues. This method ultimately shows how writers build up networks of ideas and entities that construct value positions in texts. And in these texts have multiple viewpoints. And the combination of appraisal and engagement reveals the explicit and implicit attitudes towards the ideas and entities in the text, as well as the ways that other non-evaluated entities and ideas are connected to those evaluated items. So again, going to Accessing Academic Discourse for Yagan's chapter 6, fantastic. And then I have an article in Language and Education that you can see for this method. But ultimately, this whole presentation has been about constellation analysis, showing that different methods and visualizations are useful in different problem situations, and that these methods are all designed to illuminate the ways value positions are constructed, emphasized, and downplayed in different texts. Thank you very much.
So we'll open up a little bit to questions. We've got 8 minutes or so if anybody has any questions or comments they want to throw out there for any of us.
Can I say something?
Go ahead, AV.
Shoot.
Sort out your audio.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right, you guys are all doing really important work. And it's just fascinating how you guys so clearly use LCT to get in under the problems really. So and make people, empower people to get on in their work really. And the cool thing that I find with LCT is that yes, you're using appraisal and you have that knowledge behind you, but LCT sort of gives you the shortcut in to find out where the problems are and then to work from there. And you make it visible and clear for your students. And it's just so cool. I'm just, well, yeah. Fantastic presentations.
Thanks, AV.
Thank you, AV.
Did it come through? I can't tell. Okay.
You just said nice stuff. We don't know what to say after that. F. Jackson, hello.
Hi, it's Fiona Jackson. Thank you for 3 very, very interesting and engaging presentations. And I suppose my question is most particularly directed to AJ, but could be directed to all 3 of you. And that would be how, in what ways this kind of analysis has translated into the way you give feedback to, I suppose it's more particularly to Jodie and AJ because you're working with students and Eszter's not in quite the same way with that research. But so particularly, how does that kind of analysis percolate into the way you give feedback to students? I mean, it may not have yet. I'm particularly interested that I think AJ's analysis shows how when one's dealing with very heteroglossic, multi-layered texts, and you're asking students to process, that complexity and add the layer of their responses to that multi-layeredness. And then they've got to try and find the means to articulate that and synthesize their responses. So it is complex writing, complex thinking and complex writing that they've got to do. And your analyses provide various heuristics for disaggregating in the analysis some of that complexity. And then as Anna Vera pointed out, the LCT particularly helps bring it back again. But then how do you find it filtering back into the way you give feedback to your students and their writing?
I do have a concise answer, and I'll let Jodie answer. I think for me, one of the things that blew my mind when I used Yagan's method was the double constellation thing. And it's still really hard to wrap my head around sometimes. And like, but the idea that like in this, it's not pro-slavery, anti-slavery, that what that analysis I think showed me was that, oh, there are actually 4 value positions that people can kind of create by, you know, avoiding certain ideas and playing up others. And then, you know, so like, I'm not going to talk at all about Harry being an enslaver. I'm only going to talk about him saving the world. And then I'll address his slavery by only talking about how he freed Dobby or something like that. So what it's allowed me to do is see how there are multiple positions within a value position, and that you're really, what can happen is I've been seeing how it helps me with the students clarify their value positions. So say, do you realize that you're aligning yourself with these ideas? And, you know, the students who in this case are not critical of Harry, I mean, I think they do realize what they're doing, but when you make it explicit, it kind of holds them accountable to the ideological position that they're putting themselves in. And to me, it's huge. I may not be able to convince them to take a different ideological position, but if I can expose it, I think that's a really important first step.
Thank you.
In my context, because actually Jennifer works in the art stream and I work in the science stream, so we don't have the same assignments. But one of the things doing this work really highlights to me is how are we, A, designing activities, B, teaching students how to do these activities, and C, evaluating these activities, allowing for different positions than perhaps we thought expected going into it. How do we create space for students to represent a range of positions where a range of positions are acceptable and valuable and appropriate? I'm not sure there's a concise answer, but certainly every activity I'm designing, henceforth, I'm kind of like, well, what am I expecting here? And is there any situation in which students might present something not suiting that I would not evaluate correctly? So like in this case, she taught semantic waves. There was a little bit of waving, but it wasn't big waving. So how do we account for that in our evaluation practices and in our activity design?
Thank you.
You have 2 minutes left, so I'll give a last quick question or shout out if anybody wants. Otherwise, I'll just say it's been one lovely thing about LCT 3.5 is that Eszter and AJ and I talked multiple times, but we probably never would have thought to present together, even in an in-person conference, even if we were at the same in-person conference. So thank you, organizers, all for making this happen. And yeah, I think ultimately, one of the things I didn't even realize until I saw us present together today was that, you know, these 3 presentations show how LCT can be used for good, not evil. We're grappling with really big, heavy ideas that are complex and personal, and having a way to tackle that with some system and transparency and hopefully make a difference for students or beyond is really valuable. So thank you for your attention. And yes, if you have final questions after the fact, please do get in touch. Otherwise, I'll hand over now to Mike for the next LCT North America presentation.